Chapter 1. St. Giles in the Mire. The grime on the window of the short-let apartment did little to obscure the relentless gray of the city. Rain traced meandering paths down the glass, each droplet collecting soot before joining a murky puddle on the sill. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Dr. Kenji Tanaka sat at a small, wobbly table, the screen of his laptop casting a pale blue light on his weary face. Piles of books surrounded him, their spines cracked and pages flagged with dozens of colored tabs. Antique maps were unrolled and weighted down at the corners with mugs and heavy volumes of botanical indices. His disgrace was a quiet, suffocating thing, a stain that had followed him across continents. The scandal at the university, accusations of fabricating data on a rare orchid's medicinal properties, had left his career in ruins. Now he chased ghosts. His obsession had started with a footnote in a dry, academic text about 14th century ecclesiastical architecture. It mentioned a parish, St. Giles in the Mire, quarantined during the first wave of the Great Pestilence, and subsequently struck from all official records, walled off and abandoned. Most historians dismissed it as a clerical error or a local myth. But a single, tantalizing line in the private journal of a traveling friar from 1351 had ignited something in Kenji. The friar described peering over the containment wall and seeing not death and decay, but a garden of sickening beauty, with flora unlike any of God's known creations. For weeks, Kenji had cross-referenced every pre-plague chart of the city with modern satellite imagery. He spent his dwindling funds on digital copies of municipal archives and obscure historical monographs. The city's relentless development had erased most of its medieval footprint, burying it under layers of brick, steel, and concrete. Yet, he found an anomaly. A single, city center block that defied the neat grid of property lines around it. It was a jumble of derelict warehouses, a defunct printing press, and a high, windowless brick wall that connected them all into an irregular fortress. No public records detailed what was inside. It was a void on the map, a data shadow. He pushed away from the table, the chair scraping against the bare floorboards. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford. He pulled on a worn jacket, grabbed his satchel containing a tablet, a powerful flashlight, and a soil sampling kit, relics of a former life, and headed out into the damp evening. The address led him to a forgotten industrial cul-de-sac. The air hung thick with the smell of wet pavement and diesel fumes from a nearby main road. The buildings were monoliths of soot-stained brick, their windows boarded up or shattered into jagged teeth. Here was the wall from the satellite images, higher and more imposing in person. It was a patchwork of centuries, with patches of ancient, irregular stone visible beneath crumbling Victorian brickwork and concrete repairs. A thick coat of ivy clung to it in places, its dark leaves glistening under the orange glow of a solitary street lamp. He began his circuit, running a hand along the cold, damp surface. The constant hum of the city, a sound he had grown accustomed to, seemed to recede here. It was a dead space for noise, a pocket of unnatural quiet. He pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing. Not the echo of traffic, not the rumble of the subway he knew ran somewhere beneath. Only a low, internal thrumming like blood moving through his own veins. He found it near the foundation of an old loading bay, a section where the modern brickwork had crumbled away, revealing a cavity behind it. The original stonework had been breached. It was not a large opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through and shrouded in deep shadow. From within drifted a peculiar scent. It was complex and layered. Underneath a dominant smell of rich, damp earth was a cloying sweetness, like night-blooming jasmine, but heavier, more narcotic. It was a scent that promised everything and nothing. Kenji checked the street. It was deserted. The rain had intensified, drumming a steady rhythm on the corrugated iron roof of the loading bay. This was it. The culmination of months of obsessive research, the single, desperate gamble to reclaim his name. He could picture the headlines. Lost world discovered in city center. Botanist uncovers flora that defy evolution. He could almost taste the vindication. He unzipped his satchel and pulled out the flashlight. He clicked it on, its powerful beam cutting into the darkness of the opening. The light revealed not a cellar or a sewer tunnel, but a narrow, descending passage paved with cobblestones. The stones were slick with moisture and covered in a fine, velvety moss that seemed to suck the light from his beam. He took a deep breath, the sweet, earthy smell filling his lungs. It made his head swim for a moment, a pleasant dizziness that smoothed the sharp edges of his anxiety. He got on his hands and knees, pushed his satchel through the opening first, and then began to worm his way into the gap. The rough edges of brick and stone snagged at his jacket. For a terrifying moment he thought he would get stuck, a modern man pinned in the gullet of the past. He exhaled, made himself smaller, and pushed forward. He tumbled out onto the cobblestones on the other side. He landed hard, his palms scraping against the slick stone. He lay there for a second, catching his breath, his heart hammering. He pushed himself up, retrieving his flashlight. The air here was different, thick, heavy, and still. The oppressive quiet was absolute. The city, with its sirens and its engines and its endless noise, was gone. It had been completely and utterly silenced. He swept the flashlight beam around. He was in a narrow, cobbled alley. The walls on either side were made of dark, timber-framed wattle and daub, the wood warped and blackened with age. The upper stories of the buildings leaned inward, nearly touching, blocking out the sky. He was standing in a place that had not seen the sun in centuries. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The sweet, floral scent was stronger here, a pervasive perfume that clung to the back of his throat. The alley opened into a small, triangular square, and Kenji's breath caught in his chest. His scientific mind, trained to observe, to categorize, to understand, faltered. It was a village, a perfectly preserved, perfectly dead medieval village. Huddled cottages with thatched roofs slumped like sleeping beasts. A smithy stood silent, its forge cold, a rusted hammer resting on an anvil. A public well, its stone housing covered in the same strange, light-absorbing moss, sat in the center of the square. But it was the state of things that was wrong. Everything was coated in a fine, golden dust that shimmered in his flashlight beam. Nothing was truly decayed. The thatch on the roofs was not rotten, it was petrified. The wooden doors were not crumbling, they were hard as iron. A cart stood abandoned, its wheels half sunk into the cobblestones, its wooden frame fused into a single, solid piece. It was a scene of instantaneous arrest, a place frozen at the exact moment of its death. His gaze was drawn to a figure slumped against the wall of the well. He approached cautiously, his light fixed on it. It was a man dressed in the rough tunic and hose of a medieval peasant. His head was tilted back, his mouth open in a silent scream. But it was not a skeleton. His skin was intact, though it had the pale, waxy texture of a root vegetable. A fine network of tiny, hair-like tendrils, like fungal hyphae, covered his face and hands. And from the corner of his open eye, a single, thick, amber-colored tear of sap was rolling slowly down his cheek. Kenji reached out a trembling hand, then stopped himself. This was not normal preservation. This was not peat bog or volcanic ash. This was something else. He backed away from the well, a cold dread beginning to seep through his initial awe. He spun around, trying to get his bearings, his light cutting frantic arcs through the oppressive darkness. His beam landed on a cottage near the edge of the square. Unlike the others, its door was slightly ajar. A low, rhythmic sound came from within, a soft, scraping, repetitive noise. Thump scrape, thump scrape, thump scrape. Someone was in there, someone was alive. Hope, stark and sudden, surged through him. He was not alone. He rushed to the cottage, his boots splashing in unseen puddles. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone there?" The sound from inside stopped. A profound silence descended once more, heavier than before. "Hello," he repeated, pushing the solid, petrified door. It resisted, then swung inward with a low groan that seemed to tear through the quiet. He shined his light into the one-room hovel. The source of the sound sat in the far corner. It was a woman, seated at a massive, darkwood loom that took up a quarter of the small space. Her head was bowed over her work, her long, gray hair obscuring her face. Her hands moved with a slow, mechanical grace, guiding a shuttle back and forth. Thump scrape, thump scrape. Kenji saw that her hair was not entirely hair. Interwoven with the gray strands were thin, green vines, dotted with tiny, unopened flower buds. The vines snaked down her back and arms, rooting her to the wooden chair. Her skin was as pale as the man by the well. But it was the tapestry she was weaving that made Kenji stumble backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. The tapestry was vast, spilling from the loom onto the floor in intricate folds. It was woven not with thread but with shimmering, multicolored filaments that seemed to be extruded from the vines themselves, and it depicted a scene with impossible, horrifying clarity. It showed the very square he was standing in. It showed the well, the cottages, the smithy. And in the center of the image, a small figure stood, holding a flashlight, its beam pointed directly at a cottage door. It was him. The detail was perfect, down to the brand of his jacket and the terrified expression on his face. He stared, mesmerized and horrified. The figure of the weaver did not move, did not look up. Her hands continued their work, slow and inexorable. As he watched, she guided the shuttle through the warp, and a new detail appeared on the tapestry. Behind the woven image of himself, a shape began to form in the darkness of the alley from which he had come. A tall, stooped figure, indistinct and terrible. A floorboard creaked behind him. Kenji spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. He aimed his flashlight back toward the alley entrance. The beam illuminated nothing but empty, moss-covered cobblestones, but the air had changed. The sweet scent of flowers was suddenly, overwhelmingly strong, and mixed with it now was the smell of freshly turned earth, of rot and rebirth. He was not alone in the square. The tapestry had not been a history, it had been a warning. He backed away from the cottage, away from the silent weaver and her prophetic loom, his flashlight beam shaking, searching the impenetrable shadows that pressed in on all sides of the small, dead village. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. Chapter 2: The Preservation of Form. Panic was a physical thing, a cold claw that gripped Kenji's insides and squeezed. He retreated from the weaver's cottage, stumbling backward into the center of the square, his flashlight beam a frantic, useless metronome against the ancient dark. Every shadow seemed to coalesce and then dissolve. Every gust of wind, carrying that sickeningly sweet pollen, felt like a pursuer's breath on his neck. The image from the tapestry was seared into his mind, a tall, stooped shape emerging from the alley. A thing that was now somewhere in the square with him. He had to get out. The thought was a primal scream in his head. He spun toward the alley he'd entered through, but his sense of direction was gone, lost in the disorienting, inward-leaning architecture. The village was a trap, and he had sprung it. His light caught something he had missed before, a narrow lane snaking between two slumped cottages, leading away from the main square. It seemed to lead deeper into the village, but it was an alternative to standing here, waiting for the thing from the tapestry to find him. He ran, his boots slipping on the slick, mossy stones. The lane was a winding canyon of timber and daub. The air grew thicker, the floral scent more concentrated. He burst through the other side and found himself in a different space. This was no common square. It was a garden, or what was left of one. It was a large, walled enclosure, dominated by a small stone chapel that stood at its heart. The ground was a riot of vegetation, but it was a diseased, monstrous version of a garden. Gnarled, thorny vines thick as a man's arm twisted around everything, crushing the stone walls of the enclosure. Flowers grew in unnaturally vibrant hues, crimson, violet, a blue so dark it was almost black. They grew from every possible surface, erupting from cracks in the chapel stone, hanging in thick clusters from the branches of skeletal trees, pushing up through the cobblestones themselves. And in the center of it all, in front of the chapel, was the source of the scent. Kenji's scientific curiosity momentarily pierced his terror. It was a flower, but it was colossal, the size of a small car. Its petals were a pale, pearlescent white like the inside of a seashell, and they seemed to shift and pulse with a slow, rhythmic light. It was both beautiful and utterly repellent. The mother bloom, the sepulchre rose. The name sprang into his mind, unbidden, a whisper carried on the pollen-heavy air. This was the source, the origin of the pollen that coated everything, the nectar that produced the sap, the engine of the village's strange preservation. His mind, grasping for a lifeline of logic, began to race. A fungus, a symbiotic organism that released a powerful preserving agent, a phytotoxin that paralyzed and petrified on a cellular level. He needed a sample. The thought was insane, but his professional instincts were a deeply ingrained reflex. Vindication was still a possibility, if he could get out of here with proof of this ecosystem. He moved closer, pulling a sterile collection vial and a pair of tweezers from his satchel. The air around the mother bloom was visibly thick with golden pollen, a shimmering haze that caught the beam of his flashlight. He covered his mouth and nose with the collar of his jacket and approached the edge of the enormous flower's reach. As he knelt, his light caught movement at the base of the bloom. Dozens of small, iridescent things flitted through the pollen cloud. They were insects, the size of large hornets, with slender bodies and dragonfly-like wings that beat at an invisible speed. They glowed with a faint inner light, their colors shifting from emerald to sapphire. Pollen drakes. Another name whispered into his thoughts. One of them broke from the swarm around the flower and darted toward him. It moved with incredible speed, a living jewel in the darkness. Kenji flinched, throwing an arm up. He felt a sharp, hot sting on the back of his hand. He cried out, swatting at it, and the drake zipped back into the pollen cloud. He looked at his hand. A small red welt was already forming where the creature had stung him. A strange sensation began to spread from the sting's site. It was not pain. It was a warm, pleasant numbness that moved up his arm, up his shoulder, toward his neck. The world softened at the edges. The oppressive fear that had been strangling him began to recute. The garden no longer seemed menacing. The colors of the flowers were rich and inviting. The mother bloom pulsed with a gentle, welcoming light. A memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. He was a child, no older than 7, sitting on his grandfather's porch on a warm summer evening in Kyoto. The air smelled of jasmine and hot pavement after a brief rain. His grandfather was telling him a story about the spirits that live in old trees. Kenji could almost feel the worn wood of the porch beneath his small hands, could almost hear the comforting cadence of his grandfather's voice. It was a moment of perfect, unassailable peace. He wanted to stay in that memory. He wanted to lie down in the soft, cool moss and let the feeling wash over him. A sharp, stabbing pain in his stung hand broke the reverie. He looked down. The welt was now an angry purple, and the skin around it was tightening, taking on a waxy sheen like the flesh of the man by the well. The numbness was a lie. The memory was a lure. The pollen was a weapon. He scrambled backward away from the mother bloom, his mind reeling. The narcotic effect was fading, replaced by a nauseating wave of vertigo. He had to get the pollen out of his system. Water. He needed to flush the wound. He remembered the well in the main square. He turned and fled back the way he came, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of botany, fear, and the ghost of his grandfather's voice. He stumbled back into the winding lane, his vision blurring. He burst back into the square. It was as he had left it, silent, still, and waiting. He staggered to the well, fumbling with the rusted crank mechanism for the bucket. It wouldn't budge, fused solid by time and the strange preservation. Panic gave him a surge of adrenaline. He gripped the crank with both hands, his knuckles white. He pulled, his muscles screaming in protest. With a sound of tortured metal, the crank turned just an inch. He pulled again, putting his entire weight into it. The mechanism groaned, and the rope began to slowly, painstakingly rise from the depths. Finally, the wooden bucket emerged from the darkness of the well, dripping. Kenji grabbed it, his hands shaking, and splashed the cold, clear water over the sting on his hand. The relief was immediate. The burning sensation lessened, and the creeping numbness seemed to retreat. He drank greedily from the bucket, the water tasting clean and pure. As his head cleared, he became aware of a new horror. While he had been at the well, he had not been paying attention to his surroundings. Now he saw them. In the chapel garden, he had seen the still choir through a grimy window. Here in the square there were more. A woman, her arms full of what looked like petrified firewood, stood frozen halfway to her cottage door. A blacksmith fused to his anvil, his face a mask of surprise. A group of men, mid-argument, their gestures animated but their bodies utterly motionless. He had seen them before, but in his panic he had processed them as statues, as macabre scenery. Now he saw them for what they were, the preserved, a silent congregation of the damned, and he had almost joined them. His gaze fell upon the weaver's cottage. The rhythmic thumping had resumed. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. He thought of the tapestry. It had shown his arrival. It had shown the creature that hunted him. What else could it show? Could it show a way out? He had to risk it. He was a scientist. Information was the only weapon he had. He approached the cottage again, this time with a grim resolve. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The loom mother, Mab, sat as before, her vine-choked hands moving with inexorable purpose. The sweet, cloying smell was thick in the small room. "Please," Kenji said, his voice quiet. "I don't want to harm you. I need to understand. What is this place?" Mab gave no sign she had heard him. Her head remained bowed. The shuttle moved back and forth, weaving its impossible threads. Kenji moved closer, his eyes fixed on the tapestry. The image of him at the well was now complete. He saw his own desperate struggle with the crank, the relief on his face as he drank the water. He watched, transfixed, as Mab's hands moved, weaving a new scene. The image shifted. It showed the chapel in the garden. It showed the great Mother Bloom. And then the tapestry's perspective moved, as if flying through a window into the chapel's interior. It depicted a small stone room at the back of the chapel, an apothecary's workshop. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty glass jars containing herbs and strange, dried specimens. In the center of the room was a heavy oak table. On the table lay a leather-bound book. It was open, and its pages were filled with spidery, frantic script and detailed botanical drawings. One drawing was of the Mother Bloom. Another was of the pollen drakes. The last was a terrifyingly accurate rendering of a tall, humanoid figure made of wood and vines. A way to fight back, a weakness. The apothecary must have been studying it, trying to find a cure. The book held the answers. Kenji's heart leaped with a desperate hope. He had a location. He had a goal. Suddenly the weaving stopped. Mab's hands went still on the loom. A tremor ran through her body. The tiny, unopened buds in the vines on her arms began to tremble. A low groan emanated from her chest, a sound of ancient, unending sorrow. The ground beneath Kenji's feet began to vibrate. It was a deep, powerful tremor that seemed to come from the very foundations of the village. The jars on a nearby shelf rattled. Dust rained down from the thatched roof. The groan from Mab's chest was echoed by a sound from outside, a groaning, cracking sound, like the roots of an old tree tearing through rock. Kenji looked at the tapestry. A new figure was being woven into the scene of the apothecary's workshop. It was the tall, stooped creature from his first vision, the verdant father. It was being woven standing right behind the image of the open book, as if guarding it. The groaning sound from outside grew louder. It was closer now, just outside the cottage. Kenji backed away from the loom, his newfound hope turning to ice in his veins. He had lingered too long. He had been noticed. He turned to the door, expecting to see the creature blocking his path. But the doorway was empty. The sound was coming from the ground itself. He risked a glance back at Mab. For the first time she had lifted her head. Her face was a ruin of pale, translucent skin stretched tight over bone. Her eyes were milky white, but they were fixed on him. Her mouth opened, and a single, rasping word escaped her lips, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Run!" The cobblestones just outside the cottage door erupted upwards. Dark, thorny roots, thick as pythons, tore through the ground. They were followed by something that pulled itself from the earth. It was vaguely canine in shape, a dog-like creature made of packed soil, gnarled roots, and sharp black thorns. It had no eyes, no face, only a gaping maw filled with splintered wood, a root hound. It shook the dirt from its body and let out a low, guttural snarl. Another one began to emerge from the ground beside it. The garden was sending its hunters. Kenji did not need a second warning. He bolted from the cottage, not toward the square, but toward the only other exit, a small opening in the back wall he hadn't noticed before, barely a crack. He threw himself through it, tearing his jacket on a splintered timber. He was in another alley, darker and narrower than the others. Behind him, he heard the root hounds crashing through the cottage wall, their snarls echoing in the confined space. He ran blindly deeper into the heart of the cursed village, the single word from the weaver echoing in his mind. The hunt had begun. Chapter 3: The Scent of Memory. He ran. The word from the weaver was a spur, driving him into the tight embrace of the alley. It was not a thoroughfare. It was a wound in the village's side, a cramped, forgotten space between leaning walls. The air, trapped for centuries, was stale and heavy with the scent of petrified wood and the ever-present sweetness of the garden's pollen. His flashlight beam bounced wildly, revealing slick, moss-covered cobblestones that threatened to send him sprawling with every desperate step. Behind him, a sound of splintering wood confirmed the hounds had breached the cottage. A low, guttural snarl followed, a sound of hunger given form by root and soil. It was closer than he wanted. The alley twisted, folding in on itself. The leaning upper stories of the buildings blotted out what little ambient light bled over the containment walls. He was in a tunnel of ancient grime and shadow. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Two shapes, low to the ground and unnervingly fast, bounded into the alley's entrance. They were masses of darkness, their thorny forms absorbing the distant city glow. They did not need eyes. He could hear the scrape and clatter of their root-like claws on the stone, could almost feel the vibration of their pursuit through the soles of his boots. He pushed himself faster, his lungs burning. The alley split, left or right, a choice made in a fraction of a second based on nothing. He veered right into an even narrower passage, a mistake. The path ended abruptly in a wall of collapsed timbers and plaster, a dead end. Trapped. The scraping of the hounds grew louder, echoing in the confined space. He spun around, pressing himself against the rubble, his flashlight beam trembling in his grip. The two root hounds rounded the corner, blocking the only way out. They paused, their eyeless forms turning slightly, as if tasting the air. They were constructs of the garden's will, purpose-built killing machines. One of them lowered its head and charged. Kenji reacted without thinking. He sidestepped, swinging his heavy satchel like a club. It connected with the side of the creature's head with a dull, woody thud. The hound stumbled, letting out a high-pitched snarl of what might have been surprise. The impact sent a painful shock up Kenji's arm, but it bought him a moment. He scrambled backward over the pile of rubble he had thought was a barrier. Splinters dug into his hands as he clawed his way up and over, tumbling down the other side into another section of the alley. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs. He heard the hounds crashing through the flimsy barricade of rotted wood. He was on his feet again, running, his body screaming in protest. This new stretch of alley was different. Hanging from the overhead timbers were strange, bell-shaped flowers, their petals a pale, ghostly white. Chimorchids. The name surfaced from the pollen haze in his mind. A sound reached him, cutting through his own ragged breathing. A voice. "Kenji, where are you?" He froze. He would know that voice anywhere. It was his grandfather's. It was the voice from the memory, the voice from the porch on that warm Kyoto evening. It was impossible. His grandfather had been dead for 15 years. "Grandfather," he whispered, his rational mind warring with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. "This way, I found a way out," the voice said, seeming to come from a darkened doorway just ahead. "Hurry, they are coming." The sounds of the hounds were very close now. The voice offered a sanctuary. The memory of his grandfather of safety and peace was a powerful anesthetic against his fear. He took a step toward the doorway, then another. The warmth from the pollen drake's sting, a phantom echo, bloomed in his hand. The memory was a lure. The voice was a trap. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog. "You're not real," he said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Don't be foolish, my boy," the voice cajoled, its tone a perfect imitation of his grandfather's gentle chiding. "Trust me." Behind him, the hounds were almost upon him. He could smell the damp earth of their bodies. He made his choice. He ignored the beckoning doorway and sprinted past it, deeper into the alley. As he passed, he saw the chimorchids quiver, their bell-shaped heads turning to follow him. The voice of his grandfather dissolved into a discordant, multi-toned whisper, the voices of 100 other victims, a chorus of ghostly lures. The alley finally opened up, and he burst back into the very garden he had fled. The air was thick with the shimmering gold of pollen. The colossal mother bloom pulsed at the garden's center, a silent, watching heart. The whole place felt more alive now, more hostile. The ground seemed to tremble with a low, resonant hum. Thick vines, which he now recognized as carrion vines, lay across the path to the chapel like sleeping pythons. The two root hounds emerged from the alley behind him, snarling as they entered the garden. They were home. They seemed to draw strength from the place, their thorny hides darkening, their movements becoming more fluid, more predatory. Kenji was caught in the open. The chapel was 50 yards away across a treacherous landscape. He backed away from the alley, keeping his eyes on the hounds. They began to circle him, separating, trying to flank him. He needed to reach the chapel door. It was his only chance. He took a step toward it, and the ground before him erupted. A carrion vine, quicker than a striking snake, lashed out. A wickedly sharp thorn, the size of a finger, snagged the leg of his trousers, ripping the fabric. He yelled and kicked himself free, stumbling backward. The hounds saw their opening and charged. Kenji ran. He bolted directly for the chapel, abandoning any pretense of caution. He leaped over a pulsing, glowing fungus that grew in a wide patch. He ducked under the low-hanging branch of a petrified tree. A swarm of pollen drakes rose from the mother bloom, a glittering cloud of malevolent light. They zipped through the air around him, their high-pitched humming a sound that vibrated in his teeth. He swatted at them, his arms windmilling, not caring if he was stung again. The numbness was a danger, but the hounds were a certainty. One of the hounds lunged, its maw of splintered wood snapping shut just inches from his ankle. He kicked out, connecting with its side, and the creature tumbled but immediately righted itself. He was losing ground. The chapel door seemed a mile away. The stone facade was covered in ivy, the heavy oak door bound with black, rusted iron. He was 20 feet away, 10. The hounds were right behind him, their guttural snarls a hot breath on his neck. He reached the door and threw his shoulder against it. It didn't move. It was barred or locked from the inside. He pushed again, his feet slipping on the mossy flagstones. Nothing. A shadow fell over him. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the stone of the chapel wall. He looked up. The petrified tree he had just run under was moving. Its branches, stiff and unyielding moments before, were slowly, deliberately bending, lowering toward him. The garden itself was trying to stop him. In a final, desperate act, Kenji turned to face the door, drew his leg back, and kicked, aiming for the spot where a lock might be. His boot struck the ancient oak with a loud crack. The wood, petrified and brittle, splintered. He kicked again and again, adrenaline overriding the pain in his leg. A section of the door shattered inward, creating a hole. One of the root hounds leaped, soaring through the air. Kenji threw himself through the hole he had created, landing in a heap on the cold stone floor inside. The hound's head and front claws burst through the opening a second later, its wooden jaws snapping wildly in the enclosed space. It was stuck, its body too wide to fit through the jagged hole. Kenji scrambled away, deeper into the chapel's darkness. The second hound slammed its body against the weakened door. The entire frame shuddered. It would not hold for long. He fumbled in his pocket for the heavy iron bolt he had seen on the inside of the door. His fingers found it. It was stiff with rust. He forced it, grunting with effort, and shoved it into the housing bracket. The thud of the bolt sliding home was the most reassuring sound he had ever heard. The hound outside threw itself against the door again. The wood groaned, but the bolt held. Kenji sagged against the wall, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He was safe, for now. He took a moment to let his eyes adjust to the gloom. The interior of the chapel was surprisingly large. Moonlight, filtered through the city's perpetual cloud cover, streamed through a high, arched window, illuminating swirling motes of dust and pollen. The air was cold and smelled of stone, decay, and the ever-present floral scent. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. He saw rows of pews, a simple stone altar, and a baptismal font near the entrance. Then his light fell upon the occupants of the pews, and the relief of his escape curdled into a new, more intimate kind of dread. He was not alone. The pews were filled with the still choir. Dozens of villagers sat in silent prayer, their hands clasped, their heads bowed or raised toward the altar. They were perfectly preserved, just like the others outside. A woman with a lace cap, a young boy next to her, a man with a thick beard, his face a mask of piety. They were a congregation trapped at the moment of worship. But there was a difference here. From the open mouth of each silent worshiper, a single, pale flower grew, its stem rooted deep within their throats. The flowers were all turned toward the chapel door, toward him, as if they were a field of sunflowers tracking their new sun. They were the source of the whispering lures, the collective voices he had heard from the chimorchids. He stood frozen in the aisle, the sound of the hounds, frustrated snarls and scraping claws outside a dull counterpoint to the profound, watchful silence within. He was out of the frying pan and into the tomb. The chapel was no sanctuary. It was a display case, and from the deepest shadows near the altar he heard a new sound. Not a snarl, not a whisper. It was the slow, heavy scrape of something immense shifting its weight. The tapestry had shown the verdant father guarding the book, and he had just locked himself inside its domain. Chapter 4. The Apothecary's Lament. The silence in the chapel was a living thing. It pressed in on Kenji, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart and the muffled sounds of the hounds clawing at the door. He stood in the main aisle, his flashlight beam trembling as it moved from one preserved face to another. The still choir sat in their pews, a silent testament to the garden's power. The pale flowers that grew from their throats seemed to watch him, their petals quivering slightly in a draught he could not detect. The scraping sound from the altar grew louder. It was a sound of immense weight dragging across stone. Kenji forced himself to move, his feet leaden. He crept down the aisle, his boots making no sound on the dust-covered flagstones. He kept his light low, not wanting to draw the attention of whatever lurked in the shadows ahead. The chapel was larger than it had appeared from the outside. The walls were bare stone, weeping a thin, greasy moisture. The air was cold, a damp chill that settled deep in his bones. He reached the front of the chapel. The altar was a simple, massive block of granite. Behind it the shadows were deep and absolute. The scraping had stopped. Kenji held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. He swept his light across the back wall, searching for the apothecary's workshop from Mab's tapestry. He saw a small, arching doorway to the right of the altar, half hidden by a rotting liturgical banner depicting a saint being martyred by thorns. That had to be it. Before he could move toward it, his light caught on something else. To the left of the altar stood the baptismal font. He had noticed it when he first entered, but now he saw it more clearly. It was filled to the brim, not with water, but with a viscous, shimmering liquid that glowed with a faint internal luminescence. It was the same golden color as the pollen, the same amber as the tear on the weeping man's face. It was the pure, concentrated nectar of the mother bloom, the source. He felt a strange pull toward it, a desire to dip his fingers into the glowing liquid, to taste its promise of peace. He recoiled, recognizing the garden's subtle poison. A loud crash from the main door made him jump. One of the hounds had thrown its full weight against it again. The iron-bound oak shuddered, and the bolt groaned in its housing. It would not hold forever. He had to find the book. He darted toward the small doorway behind the altar, pushed aside the crumbling banner, and slipped through. He was in a small, cramped sacristy. The room was a mess of overturned furniture and shredded vestments. A gaping hole in the back wall showed where something had torn its way out or in. But beyond the sacristy was another doorway, leading to a windowless chamber, the apothecary's workshop. It was exactly as the tapestry had depicted. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of countless glass jars and earthenware pots. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, chemicals, and the ever-present floral sweetness, but with an underlying bitter medicinal tang. A thick layer of dust and pollen covered everything. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table, its surface littered with alembics, mortars, and pestles, and dissecting tools, all rusted and fused to the wood. And there, open in the middle of the table, was the book. It was a large, leather-bound volume, its cover warped and stained. The pages were vellum, yellowed with age, and filled with a tight, frantic script written in faded iron gall ink. Kenji's hands shook as he aimed his flashlight at the pages. The text was in a cramped, heavily abbreviated form of medieval Latin, but the drawings were universal. He saw a detailed botanical illustration of the mother bloom, which the apothecary had named the Rosa sepulchrum, the tomb rose. There were notes on its life cycle, its hypnotic pollen, its preserving nectar. The apothecary had understood that it was not a plant in the conventional sense, but the fruiting body of a vast, subterranean organism, a fungal network that encompassed the entire village. He turned the page. There were sketches of the pollen drakes, apes mortis, bees of death, and the root hounds, canis radix. The apothecary had dissected them, studied them. His notes described them not as separate creatures, but as extensions of the main organism, mobile organs designed to defend the garden and spread its influence. They were the village's immune system. Kenji frantically scanned the text, his university Latin coming back to him in fits and starts. The apothecary, a man named Brother Anselm, wrote of his desperate attempts to find a cure as the preserving plague claimed his fellow villagers one by one. He had tried fire, but the preserved flesh would not burn. He had tried holy water to no effect. The organism was not demonic. It was something terrestrial but utterly alien. Then Kenji found the page he was looking for. A full-page, terrifyingly detailed drawing of the verdant father. Anselm called it the custos, the guardian. The drawing showed a towering, humanoid figure of ancient wood and woven vines, its form vaguely echoing the effigy of the nobleman who had originally commissioned the garden. Anselm's notes were more scattered here, more desperate. The custos was the organism's consciousness, its central nervous system. It was slow, but immensely powerful. It did not think in human terms. Its only imperative was to protect the mother bloom and to expand its territory. Beneath the drawing was a section titled Vulnerabilities. Kenji's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. Anselm wrote that the organism, for all its power, had a weakness. It drew its sustenance directly from the corrupted soil of the village, soil saturated with its own biological processes. It could not tolerate purity. The well water, drawn from a deep, isolated aquifer untouched by the organism's spread, was anathema to it. It did not harm the preserved, but it acted as a violent irritant to the organism's mobile extensions. But there was another, greater weakness. Anselm theorized that the organism was anchored to a single point, a heartwood. This was not the mother bloom, which was merely its reproductive organ. The heartwood was the original seed of the creature, a piece of the meteorite Anselm believed had started the plague, and it was fused to the body of the garden's founder, the cruel nobleman who had sought eternal life and had instead become the undying foundation of the monstrous garden. Destroy the heartwood, and the entire organism would die. Anselm's final, desperate scrawl indicated where he believed it was hidden, in a crypt directly beneath the altar of the chapel. A deafening crack echoed from the main hall. The chapel door burst inward, ripped from its hinges. The heavy bar clattered uselessly to the floor. The snarling of the hound ceased, replaced by a low, fearful whimper. Then silence. Kenji looked up from the book, his blood running cold. A massive silhouette filled the chapel's main doorway, blotting out the faint light from outside. It was tall, stooped, and impossibly broad. It had to duck to enter the chapel. The verdant father had arrived. He heard it move. It was not the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of nature itself in motion. A slow, deliberate dragging, the groan of ancient wood, the rustle of 1,000 dead leaves, the slithering of thick vines across stone. It moved into the chapel, and the still choir seemed to lean away from it, the flowers in their throats trembling violently. Kenji was trapped. The workshop had only one exit back into the chapel where the custos now stood. He frantically looked around the small room. There was no other door, no window. His gaze fell upon the hole in the sacristy wall, the one leading outside. It was too small for him to fit through. He was cornered. He grabbed the book. It was his only hope. He could not leave it behind. He shoved it into his satchel, his mind racing. The well water. Anselm's notes. It was a weapon. But his canteen was empty, and the well was outside, across a garden that was now actively hostile and patrolled by the guardian itself. The dragging, scraping sound was getting closer. The verdant father was moving past the pews, approaching the altar. Kenji pressed himself against the back wall of the workshop, trying to make himself small. He held his breath, hoping the creature would not notice the small doorway. The scraping stopped directly outside the sacristy. A shadow fell across the opening. Kenji could smell it now. A powerful odor of rich soil, deep rot, and a strange, electric scent like ozone. It was the smell of the garden's heart. A limb, thick as a tree trunk and made of gnarled, interwoven vines, reached into the sacristy. It moved with a slow, exploratory grace, its thorny tendrils brushing against the overturned furniture. It was searching. Kenji didn't dare breathe. The limb retracted. For a moment he thought it had missed him. Then the entire stone archway of the workshop door began to groan. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone. The verdant father was not going to bother with the door. It was going to come through the wall. Kenji's eyes darted around the room one last time, searching for an escape, for anything. His flashlight beam slid across the floor, illuminating something he had missed. Near the base of the wall opposite the door, a section of the stone floor was different. It was a single, large flagstone with a rusted iron ring set into it. A trapdoor. The entrance to the crypt. Anselm's final entry. The heartwood. The wall in front of him exploded inward. Stone and plaster rained down as the verdant father tore an opening into the workshop. A massive wooden hand, its fingers long, sharp branches, reached in, swatting the apothecary's table aside. Jars shattered and clouds of ancient dust billowed into the air. Through the newly made hole, Kenji saw the creature's face for the first time. It had no eyes, no mouth. It was a knot of ancient, bark-like wood, with the faint, ghostly outline of a man's screaming face trapped within the grain. Kenji scrambled for the iron ring, his fingers closing around the cold, rough metal. He pulled. It was sealed shut with age and grime. He pulled again, his feet slipping on the dusty floor, every muscle in his body straining. The guardian's hand swiped through the air where he had been moments before, its branch-like fingers scraping deep gouges in the stone wall. With a final, agonized heave, the flagstone shifted, scraping open with a deafening screech of stone on stone. It revealed a black, square hole, and a set of steep, narrow steps descending into absolute darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cold and foul, a smell of stagnant water and true decay, a scent entirely different from the garden's perfume. He didn't hesitate. He swung his legs into the opening, the book-heavy satchel banging against his side, and half fell, half climbed down the steps, plunging into the crypt below. He landed on a damp, earthen floor as the sound of the verdant father's rage, a deep, tearing, groaning sound that shook the very foundations of the chapel, echoed from the room above. He had the knowledge. He had found the path to the heartwood. But he had also just trapped himself in a tomb, deep beneath the earth, with the garden's god tearing apart the only exit. Chapter 5: A Tomb for the Living. The darkness of the crypt was total. It was a physical presence, a cold, heavy blanket that muffled sound and stole the breath. Kenji landed on an uneven, damp earthen floor, his ankle twisting painfully. He bit back a cry, fumbling for the flashlight he dropped in his desperate descent. His fingers brushed against cold metal, and he clicked it on. The beam cut a fragile, trembling circle in an abyss of black. He was in a small, square chamber, its walls rough-hewn from the bedrock beneath the chapel. The air was thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water, a foul, primordial odor that was almost a relief after the cloying sweetness of the garden above. Water dripped from the low ceiling, each drop echoing in the oppressive silence. The sounds from the workshop were muffled but still terrifying, a continuous, grinding rage as the verdant father tore the room apart, searching for him. Kenji swept the light around the chamber. The crypt was not empty. 3 stone sarcophagi rested on low plinths, their surfaces covered in a sheen of grimy moisture. They were simple, unadorned, the final resting places of forgotten nobles or pious church elders. According to Anselm's frantic notes, one of these should contain the nobleman, the garden's founder, and within him the heartwood. The grinding from above stopped. A new sound replaced it, a heavy, dragging scrape moving from the workshop back into the main chapel. Then a tremendous, resonant thud as if a great weight had been set down. Silence. Kenji waited, his body tensed. A soft, rustling sound began, barely audible. It was the sound of roots. Thousands of small, questing roots forcing their way through the mortar of the stone ceiling above. The custos wasn't going to tear its way down. It was going to grow its way in. It was going to seal him in this tomb. Time was running out. He turned his attention to the sarcophagi. Which one? There were no inscriptions, no clues. He approached the nearest one, its lid a single, massive slab of granite. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. It didn't budge. He tried the second with the same result. They were designed to keep the dead in and the living out. He needed leverage. His flashlight beam darted around the room, searching for anything he could use. He saw it leaning in a dark corner, a long, rusted iron rod, probably a poker from a long-extinguished brazier. It was heavy and solid. He jammed one end into the thin crack between the first sarcophagus and its lid and put his full weight on it. The rust on the poker flaked away under the strain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grating shriek of stone on stone that set his teeth on edge, the lid shifted. Just an inch. He worked frantically, repositioning the bar, heaving with all his might. The lid scraped further across, revealing a black cavity within. He shone his light inside. A skeleton lay within, draped in the tattered remains of a burial shroud. It was just a man. No sign of the heartwood, no sign of any unnatural preservation. The rustling from the ceiling was louder now, a constant whispering hiss. Fine tendrils of dark root, no thicker than thread, were pushing through the cracks between the stones, wriggling like worms in the air. He moved to the second sarcophagus. Again he fought with the lid, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged pants. This one was heavier. It took all his strength to move it. Finally, it slid aside. Inside lay another skeleton, this one smaller, likely a woman. Nothing. That left only one. The third sarcophagus was set against the far wall, directly beneath the spot where the chapel altar would be. He wedged the iron bar into the seam. As he pushed, he felt a strange resistance, a springiness that the others had not had. The rustling from the ceiling intensified, concentrating directly above him. The garden knew which tomb he was trying to open. He gave a final, desperate shove. The lid slid open with a wet, tearing sound. The stench that billowed out was not the dry scent of dust and bone. It was a rancid, organic smell of ancient rot and alien biology. Kenji stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. He forced himself to look. The interior of the sarcophagus was not dry. It was lined with a pulsating, fleshy substance that looked like a cross between fungus and muscle tissue. And nestled within this living cradle was a body. It was not a skeleton. It was a man, dressed in the decaying finery of a 14th-century nobleman. His body was in a state of horrific preservation, his skin a translucent gray, his features twisted in a rictus of eternal agony. His chest cavity was open, his ribs spread wide like a gruesome, blossoming flower. And in the center of his chest, where his heart should have been, was the heartwood. It was a chunk of black, crystalline rock, the size of a human fist. It was not entirely stone. Dark, pulsing veins of organic matter snaked across its surface, burrowing deep into the nobleman's flesh and connecting him to the living lining of the tomb. The rock itself seemed to drink the light from Kenji's flashlight, a point of absolute darkness. It hummed with a low, malevolent energy that he could feel in his bones, a vibration that resonated with the roots now pouring from the ceiling. This was the nexus, the anchor, the source of the curse. Anselm's notes had been unclear on how to destroy it. Fire had no effect on the preserved flesh. Brute force seemed the only option. Kenji hefted the heavy iron poker. He had one chance. As he raised the rod, the nobleman's eyes snapped open. They were solid black orbs, glistening with the same foul nectar as the font above. A silent scream contorted his face. The entire crypt vibrated as the heartwood pulsed with a sudden, furious energy. The roots pouring from the ceiling grew thicker, faster, coalescing into thorny, vine-like appendages. They whipped down toward him, trying to entangle him. Kenji dodged, ducking under a lashing vine that shattered a chunk of stone from the wall where his head had been. He scrambled closer to the sarcophagus, raising the iron rod high. He brought it down with all the force he could muster, aiming for the center of the crystalline heartwood. The impact was immense. A deafening crack echoed through the small chamber, not of stone, but of something like obsidian shattering. A network of glowing, red fissures spiderwebbed across the heartwood's black surface. A piercing, high-frequency screech erupted from the nobleman's open mouth, a sound that bypassed Kenji's ears and stabbed directly into his brain. He cried out, dropping the poker and clutching his head. The effect on the garden was instantaneous and catastrophic. The roots writhing from the ceiling went rigid, then began to crumble into dry, black dust. The pulsating, fleshy lining of the sarcophagus deflated with a wet sigh, turning a sickly gray. The nobleman's body convulsed violently, then went limp, the black light in his eyes extinguishing. Above, Kenji heard a sound he would never forget. It was the death cry of the verdant father, a long, drawn-out groan of tearing wood and snapping vines, a sound of immense, ancient agony that shook the entire chapel. It ended with a final, shuddering crash as the custos collapsed. Then silence. A true, empty silence devoid of the garden's hum, devoid of the rustling roots. Kenji lay on the crypt floor, his head ringing. He pushed himself up, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked at the heartwood. The red cracks were fading, but the stone itself seemed inert, its malevolent energy gone. He had done it. Anselm's final, desperate hope had been realized. He knew he couldn't stay. The crypt was a tomb and the way out was still blocked. He retrieved his flashlight and the iron poker and climbed the steps back into the apothecary's workshop. The room was a scene of utter devastation. The wall was gone. The shelves had been obliterated, but the path into the chapel was clear. He stepped into the main hall. The body of the verdant father lay in a colossal heap near the front pews. It was no longer a creature of terrifying power. It was just a pile of dead wood and withered vines, rapidly decaying into a mulch-like substance on the stone floor. The still choir remained in their pews, but the flowers in their throats had wilted, their pale petals turning brown and crumbling to dust. He crossed the chapel to the ruined main door and stepped outside. The change was breathtaking. The garden was dying. The unnaturally vibrant flowers had turned black and were dissolving into a foul-smelling sludge. The thorny carrion vines had gone limp and brittle, shattering like glass when he touched them with his boot. The mother bloom, the great sepulchre rose, had collapsed in on itself, its pearlescent petals now a heap of gray, decaying tissue that smelled like spoiled meat. The air was still and clean, the narcotic sweetness replaced by the smell of rot and decay, a natural, final decay. The two root hounds lay where they had fallen, their forms already crumbling back into simple dirt and dry roots. The pollen drakes were gone, vanished like smoke. He walked through the dying garden, a liberator in a city of the dead. He felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He reached the main square. The preserved villagers were unchanged, their waxy flesh and silent screams a permanent fixture of the landscape. He had killed the garden, but he could not undo its work. They were monuments to a centuries-old tragedy. He found the weaver, Mab, slumped over her loom. The vines in her hair were now dry and brown. The vast tapestry she had been weaving had unraveled into a pile of dull, lifeless fibers. Her hands were still. He gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold, but it felt like skin, not wax. He could not tell if she was finally at peace or simply broken. He made his way back to the hidden entrance, the narrow passage that led to his world. The city's hum, once an oppressive noise, was now a comforting, welcome sound. He squeezed back through the opening in the wall, emerging into the grimy cul-de-sac, blinking against the orange glow of the streetlights. Rain was still falling. It felt clean. He leaned against the cold brick wall, gasping the damp, diesel-tinged air. He looked at his hands, half expecting them to be covered in pollen or sap. They were just scraped and dirty. He reached into his satchel, his fingers closing around the hard leather spine of Anselm's book. He had the proof. He had the story that would change everything. But as he stood there, a new, cold thought began to form in his mind. He had seen what the garden could do. He had seen its power to preserve, to animate, to create life from death. He had destroyed its heart, its anchor. But Anselm's notes had mentioned that the mother bloom released spores, not just pollen. Spores designed to travel, to find new soil. He had killed the root. But what if a seed had already escaped? What if, somewhere out in the sprawling, indifferent city, a new garden was already beginning to grow? The horror was not over. It had just been transplanted. Chapter 6: The Transplanted Seed. Days bled into a week. Kenji did not leave the grimy, short-let apartment. He existed in a state of suspended animation, caught between the suffocating reality of the city and the vivid, waking nightmares of the village. He slept in fits, waking with the phantom scent of the sepulchre rose in his nostrils or the imagined scrape of a root hound's claw at the door. During the day, he sat with Anselm's book, the pages a constant, terrifying reminder. The world outside the window seemed muted, its colors washed out, its sounds distant and unimportant. He had the story that could rebuild his life, but the thought of sharing it filled him with a paralytic dread. How could he explain it? A walled-off village, a sentient garden, a creature of wood and vine. They would call him a madman. The fabricated data scandal would be dredged up, used as proof of a mind prone to fantasy. He would be trading one form of professional ruin for another, more public one. He would become a laughingstock, a cautionary tale whispered at academic conferences. And there was a deeper fear, the fear of Anselm's final, unspoken warning, the spores, the possibility that he had not ended the threat but merely scattered it. To reveal the village would be to draw attention to it. Scientists, government agencies, disaster tourists, a parade of the curious and the skeptical would descend on that quiet cul-de-sac. They would break down the walls. they would take samples. And in their ignorance, they could carry a dormant spore out into the wider world, planting it in the fertile soil of a city park or a suburban garden. He, Kenji Tanaka, the disgraced botanist, would be the man who unleashed a plague of immortality on the world. He kept the book hidden, wrapped in a plastic bag at the bottom of his satchel. It felt radioactive, a toxic secret that poisoned his every thought. On the 8th day, a sharp, insistent knocking at his door jolted him from his stupor. He ignored it. It came again, louder this time. "Dr. Tanaka, Kenji Tanaka, this is the building manager. Your short-term lease is expired. You need to vacate the premises." The mundane reality of it was a shock. Rent, leases. The world had not stopped turning. He stumbled to the door and opened it. A stout, unimpressed man with a clipboard stood in the hallway. "Right," the manager said, peering past Kenji at the chaotic state of the room. "You've got 1 hour. Then I'm changing the locks." The ultimatum was a mercy. It forced him to act. He moved with a numb efficiency, packing his few belongings, shoving the maps and research papers into a recycling bin. He paused over Anselm's book. He couldn't throw it away. He couldn't keep it. He compromised, shoving it deep into his satchel, a burden he was not yet ready to relinquish. He walked out into the city, his satchel a heavy weight on his shoulder. The streets were a cacophony of sirens, horns, and the overlapping conversations of 1,000 strangers. Everyone seemed to be moving with a purpose he no longer possessed. He found himself walking without a destination, his path dictated by a subconscious pull. After an hour, he recognized the soot-stained brick and forgotten industrial landscape. He was back at the cul-de-sac. He approached the wall, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The hole was still there, a dark mouth in the crumbling brick. He hesitated, then squeezed through one last time. The change was absolute. The village was gone, not just dead but erased. Where the garden had been was now a field of fine gray ash and dark, sterile soil. The cottages had collapsed into piles of rotted timber and dust. The mother bloom, the verdant father, the root hounds, all had decayed into nothing, their substance reclaimed by the earth. It was as if a silent, intense fire had consumed everything, leaving only a scar. The preserved villagers were gone too. Their bodies, no longer held in stasis by the garden's power, had succumbed to 600 years of decay in a matter of days. All that remained were skeletons, clad in the dusty tatters of their clothing, lying where they had once stood. The still choir were bony figures in the rubble of the collapsed chapel. Mab was a skeleton hunched over a pile of wood dust that had been her loom. It was a scene of final, definitive death. The tragedy had at last been allowed to end. Kenji walked to the center of what had been the square. He unzipped his satchel, took out Anselm's book, and laid it on the ashen ground. He had a small lighter in his pocket. He flicked it on, the small flame a defiant spark in the gray desolation. He held it to the corner of the vellum pages. They resisted for a moment, then caught, curling and blackening. The flame spread, consuming Anselm's frantic script, his beautiful and terrible drawings. It was an act of terrible intellectual vandalism, but it was also an act of quarantine. He was burying the secret, ensuring no one could ever follow his path. He watched until the book was a pile of black, brittle ash, which a sudden gust of wind scattered across the dead ground. He turned and left the village without looking back, squeezing through the hole for the last time. As he stepped out, he saw he was no longer alone. A man stood by the loading bay, sheltering from the light drizzle. He was older, with a kind, weary face, and wore the uniform of a city maintenance worker. He held a small flask in his hand. It was Pops O'Malley, the man Kenji's landlord had mentioned once, the one who worked the strange routes. "Quiet in there today," Pops said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at Kenji but at the wall. "First time in 50 years. Kenji stared at him. "You know about this place?" Pops took a slow sip from his flask. "Don't know what's in there. Never wanted to. All I know is that my father told me to leave an offering now and then for the quiet folk. Said it kept things balanced. His father told him the same. Some things. You don't need to understand them to respect them." He looked at Kenji, his gaze surprisingly sharp. "Sounds like the quiet folk are finally sleeping." Kenji just nodded, unable to form words. Pops gave him a long, searching look, then seemed to reach a conclusion. He nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. The old guardian and the new. Pops pushed himself off the wall and began to walk away, his shift over. Kenji was alone again. He should have felt relief. The garden was dead, the book was destroyed, the secret was safe, but a profound unease settled over him. He had been so focused on the grand, monstrous nature of the garden that he had overlooked the small details. He thought back to his escape, to the chase through the alleys. He remembered the chime orchids, the flowers that mimicked voices. He remembered the grave moss that showed you visions of a peaceful death. Simple pollen dispersal was crude. The garden was intelligent. It was a master of mimicry and subtle infiltration. His eyes fell to the ground. Near the entrance to the hole where the rain had collected was a patch of mud. In the mud were his own footprints leading out, and next to them, almost invisible, was another set of tracks, the four-toed print of a cat. He remembered the feral cats from Anselm's notes, the immune, malevolent spies of the garden. He had not seen a single one. A cold dread, more profound than any he had felt in the garden, crept over him. The organism didn't need a human to carry its spores. It had its own agents. A cat, unnoticed, could slip out of the village, its fur seeded with dormant life. It could travel for miles, finding a home in a public park, a botanical garden, or someone's overgrown backyard. It would find rich, pure soil and it would lie down, and a single, microscopic spore would begin its work. It wouldn't be a monstrous, uncontrolled growth like St. Giles in the mire. The organism was intelligent. It had learned. This time it would be subtle. A single, beautiful, unknown species of flower appearing in a city park. A flower with a uniquely captivating scent, a scent that smelled of your most cherished memory. A flower that would draw people to it. They would want to touch it, to pick it, to take it home and plant it in their own gardens. A transplant. Kenji slowly backed away from the wall. His gaze lifted from the ground and swept across the city skyline. He saw the distant green smudges of parks, the manicured flower beds of corporate plazas, the countless window boxes on apartment balconies. The entire city was a potential vessel. He had not destroyed a monster. He had merely forced it to evolve. The horror was not contained in a walled-off village anymore. It was free. And somewhere, in the heart of the bustling, indifferent city, a new garden was being sown. The end.